Thank you so much. First off, can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Not my first time in Newport, but my first time ever speaking in Rhode Island. So it is a real pleasure and a treat to be here with you, ladies and gentlemen, this evening. So thank you all very much for attending. This episode of my life here, and that's really what it has been for the last couple of years, is the fault of a person sitting over there. First off, is anybody here, how many people here, are familiar with the website All Things Liberty, Journal of the American Revolution? Or, well, there's a wonderful website called All Things Liberty, Journal of the American Revolution, wherein for free of charge, you will find over 800 articles on virtually every subject of the American Revolution that you could possibly want, on just about anything you want. And they are well researched by over 140 authors now.
And counting.
And counting. So it is incredible. Well, Don Haggis over here is the principal editor for Journal of the American Revolution. And he approached me a couple of years ago in a hypothetical conversation about the journal publishing their own series of books. They have an actual hardcover annual wherein they take a number of the best articles from each year and put them together and publish them as a hardbound copy. But this was going to be something new, an actual series of books on lesser-known events of the American Revolution. There's plenty of books out there on the Battle of Saratoga or Yorktown or Trenton or something like that, and I'm sure you folks have read them all. I have. And, you know, there's only so many ways you can nuance something that's been written 100 times before. And there's such a vast amount of things that went on during the American Revolution here, New York, Boston, the South, everywhere, that no one really talks about. All right? Those are the things that interest me, and apparently they interest a number of other people. So Don approached me about, do you think you could possibly do something? I said, sure. And after a few months, it progressed into a book. And that's basically a year and a half of my life I will probably never get back. But it's been a marvelous, marvelous experience. And it allows me the opportunity to go to a number of different cities and towns and speak with people such as yourselves about these lesser-known events of the American Revolution. So I am extremely pleased and honored to be here this evening. So let's start off where we are at this point in the American Revolution. We're going to start in March of 1778. All right? It's been a mixed year, 1777, for each side of the war. The Americans had their big victory over General Burgoyne at Saratoga, but General Howe has captured Philadelphia from the Americans. They've defeated Washington's army at Brandywine, Paoli, and Germantown, and Washington's troops are sitting somewhat unhappily at Valley Forge. Well, Sir William Howe, the British Commander-in-Chief, has had enough of the war. He wants to go home. He has written to Lord George Germain, Principal Secretary of State for American Affairs, about being relieved of command. Germain says, fine, we're going to appoint Sir Henry Clinton. Clinton has been Howe's second in command. At the time, he was commander of the British forces at New York City. So Clinton is going to get elevated to Commander-in-Chief of the Army in America. That means everything between Nova Scotia and West Florida. So he sails from New York to Philadelphia to take the command. Gets his orders. Germain writes them up in March of 78, sends them off. Well, Germain sends off another letter to Clinton just 1 week later. And the rosy scenario of the previous week is suddenly gone. Does anybody know what happened in 1 week in March of 78 that would change everything? Anybody but Don. So, yes.
The French came?
The French. The French have signed the treaty with the Americans, and the British know that is instantly going to lead to war. So the event is celebrated, of course, in America, but it is very bad news for the British, because the British had maintained sort of an equal footing on land, but where they've always held superiority is the sea. What is Great Britain? What is England? At its core, it's an island. So it does not need, per se, a large army. It's not one of the bigger armies of Europe, it's one of the smallest ones. But where England has always stood forth is the Royal Navy. As long as England controls the seas, England survives. There is no American Navy to counter the Royal Navy. So there's a few Continental frigates, but there's no giant ships of the line that the British command that are going to be challenging them. Americans exist primarily on the sea in the form of privateers, private armed vessels preying on virtually unarmed merchant ships. But with the entry of France into the war, that brings in the French fleet. The French fleet is nearly the equal of the British fleet. The French can launch attacks of their own where the British are weak. So that leads to some problems. So Lord Germain tells Clinton, we're going to have to rethink things about how the war is being fought. He tells Clinton, you need to reinforce some of your outposts, and you need to launch an expedition almost immediately against the French. So the first thing you need to do is evacuate Philadelphia, go to New York, consolidate your forces, and of those 25,000 or so men you have in New York, you need to get rid of 10,000 of them. 40% of the British Army is going to be sent away. While they're still, some of them will be still under Clinton's commands, they're going to go to places like Pensacola, the capital of West Florida. They're going to go to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Some of them are going to go to Bermuda. A huge 5,000-man expedition under General Grant is going to be sent to the West Indies to attack the French there. They're going to send 2,500 men to attack Georgia, because frankly, by that time, the Georgians have just been asking for it. Everything is just sitting there in the south. Might as well just attack them. So send an expedition to the south. Well, what's going to be left to Clinton is an army that is only going to be equal to, if not inferior to, Washington's army. Because while sitting at Valley Forge, Washington is awaiting the arrival of many, many, many thousands of new recruits. And his army is going to swell from 6, 7, 8,000 all the way up, including militia, to 20,000 men. All right, the Battle of Monmouth that ensues surrounding Clinton's march across New Jersey, one of the biggest battles of the war. So Clinton is not a happy person. Germain tells him, well, strike at some of the enemy's seaports. Use the Royal Navy to advantage, embark a few guys, attack a seaport, destroy some privateers. Let's see what happens that way when you start hitting the Americans in the wallet. June 1778, Clinton abandons Philadelphia, the march across New Jersey, he arrives at New York. That's a map of New York Island, Long Island, Staten Island, Paul's Hook. All those places the British have to occupy. It takes about 7,500 men simply to garrison all those places. So if Clinton's only going to have about 15,000 men after sending off all these embarkations, that's only going to leave him an effective force of maybe 7,500 to go out and do battle, because he has to leave about an equal number behind to do garrison. He can take a few more if he wants to be really risky. Clinton generally is not really risky. No sooner does Clinton get up to New York City than a French fleet under the Count d'Estaing arrives off of Sandy Hook. This causes widespread celebrations and anticipation in the American lines. They feel now that their French ally is here, they're going to be able to sail into New York, defeat the Royal Navy, which has always kept Washington away from attacking New York, because New York, like England, is an island. And great things will happen. The war will be over. Except the French cannot get into the harbor. That's a problem. So they look around, Sandy Hook is now fortified, Brooklyn, Staten Island, the channel is too shallow, so the French turn around and disappear. There's great rejoicing with the British, not so much with the Americans. The American Army has shadowed Clinton up to New York, and they're now deployed primarily to the north of Manhattan in Westchester, around White Plains. The gist of the book covers the period from mid-August 1778 to the end of October. And along the course of the way, you're introduced to no less than 14 skirmishes and battles, all of which we are going to cover today in excruciating minute detail. I'm kidding. But there's a few that stand out that are kind of neat. In the Bronx, there is an affair that actually involves Indians. So if you went to the Bronx today, anything involving Indians would be from Cleveland at a Yankee game. All right? Not the case here. As you're probably aware, most native tribes allied with the British during the war. And they were primarily north out of Canada or in the south along the Georgia and Carolina border. But this tribe of Stockbridge Indians was from western Massachusetts. They had settled there previously to escape the French and Indian War and had lent their assistance during the time of Burgoyne's incursion into New York in 1777. Well, in July of 78, about 60 of them volunteered to serve under Washington at White Plains. They were put into a part of the American Light Infantry. We'll talk about the Light Infantry more in a few minutes. But in this August encounter, August 31st, 78, this Indian tribe of Stockbridge Indians, plus some light infantrymen, get ambushed. They're not ambushed by British, they're ambushed by Loyalists and Germans. Light infantry troops from the Queen's Rangers, the British Legion of the famous Bannister Tarleton, Emmerich Chasseurs, and German Jaegers. The end result is a fierce little fight. The Indians caused casualties disproportionate to their numbers. In fact, they almost killed John Brave Simcoe, which would have made an interesting turn, as it were, on AMC. But Simcoe is saved, and the Indians are pretty much wiped out. So about half of them, including most of their senior chiefs, are killed. Westchester is the focus for a lot in August and September. They are skirmishing back and forth with light infantry from both sides. A lot of the troops on the British side are actually wearing green. I mean, the Loyalist troops and the Queen's Rangers and Emmerichs and the British Legion are in green. Those two green coats there are Hessian Jaegers, riflemen. Jaeger means hunter. So they're not armed with muskets, they're armed with short rifles. Rifles, of course, fire more accurately and further than a musket. Gentleman on the right is Mordecai Gist, Pride of Baltimore. Gist is the commander of one of Washington's light infantry battalions. He's got his command at a place called Babcock's House. A lot of them, it's a little frustrating today because they refer to areas by who lived there. Well, those people don't live there anymore, so it's not always recognizable where they're talking about. In this case, it was the widow Babcock's house. And in the course of doing research for this, there were some lovely 19th century accounts of Gist and the widow Babcock becoming friendly and perhaps distracting Gist, who was almost cut off by our friends the Jaegers here, the Queen's Rangers, the British Legion, etc. Except the Jaegers didn't go where they were supposed to, and Gist's command got out of there, shy about 40 men. Promised to talk about the light troops. The gentleman on the left, that is John Brave Simcoe. All right, anybody here watch Turn on AMC? Okay, you may be confused at looking at Simcoe there because he's not actually dripping blood. Okay? Simcoe of the 18th century, much less psychotic than the Simcoe of the TV show. Actually, a pretty good gentleman by 18th century standards. well respected at the time. After the war, he became the lieutenant governor of the new province of Upper Canada, which you know today as Ontario. And that's actually when from that portrait dates. So Simcoe is the commander of the Queen's Rangers, if you watch Term you know that, and takes part in a lot of these skirmishes in the book. Now, the gentleman on the right is Richard Butler. We'll talk about him in a second. The composition of the American Light Infantry. American Light Infantry is not an easy thing to study. It changes every campaign. And actually in 1778 it appears to have changed twice during the campaign. And that just makes things so much fun when you're not really a great American Continental Army historian and you try and figure it all out without a scorecard. But we're able to do that pretty well. American Light Infantry, with all its attached units, the American cavalry, legions such as Lee's Legion, Armand's Legion, militia units, 9 months men units, because the men served for 9 months and they can come up with nothing more clever to call them. They compose a corps of about 2,300 men under General Charles Scott. Scott has organized his units mostly into 3 battalions, and these are men drawn from every continental unit, all right, including the Rhode Islanders, the other New Englanders, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and they're forming these units. And in the research, I'm like, okay, let's see if I can find somebody who actually served in one of these units. When I research, when I write, I always feel it's best to have these people tell their stories better than I can tell their stories. So they went through the turmoil, I didn't. So they can put it into their own words very nicely, and then that way they speak to us today. I think, okay, so who served in the American Light Infantry? I don't know anybody. Let me look at my bookshelf. And I'm like, it can't be that easy. And I took the book off the bookshelf, and I'm like, wow, it is that easy. Anybody here ever heard of a Continental Army soldier by the name of Joseph Plum Martin? Private Yankee Doodle. Yes, Joseph Plum Martin from Connecticut, a teenager, served in one of these light infantry units. Yay me, my work got so much easier all of a sudden. So, Martin, of course, chronicled his service in the war. Afterwards, he was a private in the 8th Connecticut Regiment, and he became a member of one of these light infantry units. So, we're going to let Joseph Plum Martin tell us about the Continental Light Infantry. We lay at the White Plains some time. While here, I was transferred to the light infantry, when I was immediately marched down to the lines. There were 3 regiments of light infantry, composed of men from the whole main army. It was a motley group: Yankees, Irishmen, buckskins, and whatnot. The regiment that I belonged to was made up of about 1/2 New Englanders, and the remainder were chiefly Pennsylvanians. 2 sets of people as opposite in manners and customs as light and darkness. Consequently, there was not much cordiality subsisting between us, for, to tell the sober truth, I had in those days of life have been incorporated with a tribe of Western Indians, as with any of those Southern troops, especially of those which consisted mostly, as the Pennsylvanians did, of foreigners. To make a bad matter worse, I was often, when on duty, the only Yankee that happened to be on the same tour for several days together. The bloody Yankee, or the damned Yankee, was the mildest epithets that they would bestow upon me at such times. It often made me think, or at least of my regiment of fellow Yankees. Our regiment was commanded by a Colonel Richard Butler, of Pennsylvania. Our friend on the right there. He was a brave officer, but a fiery, austere hothead. Whenever he had a dispute with a brother officer, and that was pretty often, he would never resort to pistols and swords, but always to his fist. I have more than once or twice seen him with a black eye, and have seen other officers that he honored with the same badge. Well, if you watch Turn, you know that it basically centers around intelligence gathering, spies. spies were a lot less formal in the 18th century than they are today. There's no James Bond. There was no James Bond. Well, I guess technically there is no James Bond today. But there was no James Bond type person. They utilized many sources to gather intelligence. The Culper gang on Long Island was really not a gang at this point, and Washington was scrambling for all sorts of intelligence, and his officers were mixed in their results. The British, however, had a first-rate intelligence gathering service, and that operated out of one of their staff positions, the Adjutant General's office. Different Adjutant General's officers had different tasks. Some were merely paper pushers making out returns and things of that nature. Others, however, ran the Secret Service. They were the voice of the Commander-in-Chief about what was going on with the enemy. And they gathered information from all different sources. Enemy deserters, prisoners that had been exchanged, country people coming in to sell produce in the market. And in one particular case, at least in Westchester in 1778, they utilized a loyalist woman, a Philadelphia school teacher by the name of Anne Bates. Anne was married to a loyalist serving in the British Royal Artillery's civil branches. And for whatever reason, she was well versed in Westchester. They sent Anne up to White Plains to go into Washington's camp to make contact with a Pennsylvania captain in the Continental Army who had made contact to say he was going to desert to the British with information. They sent Anne up to facilitate this. By the time she got up there into White Plains in September of '78, the captain had already resigned his commission and gone home to Pennsylvania. Couldn't wait. Well, Our Lady spy here was very clever. That basket of goodies she has there, that isn't actually Anne, but we'll play along for today. That basket of goodies in there, she has a number of sewing kits. Under the guise of being a petty sutler, someone who sells small goods to the army, follows the army. In her basket of goodies, she's created these sewing kits of thread, needles, pins, cloth, etc. Things that soldiers or their families would need in camp. Clothing tears, clothing needs repair. You're an actor, you know that very well. So she's selling these things, but she's going around Washington's camp. She's counting. She's counting men, she's counting cannons, she's counting horses. And she's taking these sewing kits and she's arranging the pins and the needles and the thimbles and the cloth and the string that it means something to her. So many thimbles, so many pins mean so many men, so many horses, so many cannons. Nobody else looking at that can decipher what it could possibly be, but she knows. She makes her way back to the British lines, not before being captured, but escaping, gives a report to the British. They say, "Thank you, Anne, very much. Now go back and do some more." So they keep send her back at least several more times to gather information. So she's one of my favorite parts of the story. And figuring out who it was even more fun. A lot of the intelligence was gathered up into a book called a memorandum book. And when they referred to some of this intelligence gathered, they simply referred to the person bringing in the intelligence as the woman, right? Hence the title of this slide. Well, there's plenty of women back then. How do I know who this was? By chance, being on a research trip to England in the late 90s, I just happened to go into the British Treasury papers, and for after the war, and in 1785, so I found this memorial from a Philadelphia school teacher detailing all this information that she wasn't paid for by the British. She got paid some money at different times, but she had some outstanding bills, shall we say, and she was pressing her claim to get them paid. The information she put down in this petition, it was lengthy, matched perfectly everything that was in the memorandum book. So it was a perfect match. The memorandum book, by the way, is in the Library of Congress. So this was a across the ocean sort of love connection here. Very nice. While all this is going on, Those French ships that had sailed away from Sandy Hook, seemingly to nowhere, showed up here off of Rhode Island. And what was going on here in Rhode Island, most of you folks, I'm sure, know very well. Rhode Island had been captured by the British in December of 1776. There was an abortive attempt to retake it in 1777, but General John Sullivan seriously wanted to take it back in August of 1778. He crossed over from Maine with double the force that the British had. The British were commanded by General Piggott with about 5,500 troops. And with the French fleet cutting off Rhode Island and all these troops here, everyone was giddy at the fact that now they're going to be able to take Newport. So Count d'Estaing is going to be the new French hero. Well, not so fast. Sir Henry Clinton at New York knows the French have arrived off of Rhode Island, and he is going to rally both the Navy and the Army to come to Newport's assistance. The commander of the Royal Navy, Admiral Richard Howe, Lord Richard Howe, gathers up as many Royal Navy ships as he can. His fleet is inferior to the French because the British were slow in getting reinforcements of ships here. The French fleet had arrived here before most of the British reinforcements could. But Howe gathers up all the warships he can. At the same time, Clinton embarks 4,000 troops on board transports. They're going to sail in two different fleets. You don't want the transports with the battleships, because you don't want those transports anywhere near a naval battle. So they're going to send Howe to engage the French. The French know Howe has arrived. They sail away from Newport, and they're going to engage in this great big gigantic naval battle off of Newport. And how did that turn out? Well, it didn't, because there was no big gigantic naval battle off Newport. Mother Nature intervened right at the start of it. So whatever damage was done by each opposing side, a storm did twice as much damage to the navies. So the British limped off a little to regain the regroup. The French sailed back here and realized the British there, they need to refit more than they can do here. So they take all the French away from here and sail back up to Boston. Sir Henry Clinton can now enter and be the new hero of Newport. But General Piggott really doesn't give him a chance. August 29th, the Americans are moving off the north part of the island. Piggott sallies out with his troops and engages in the Battle of Quaker Hill. It's a sharp action. The British sustain a number of casualties, but Sullivan gets his troops off safely. Clinton sails in a couple days later, thinking that Sullivan's force is still on the island, and he can take command and be the savior of Newport. He's not happy that Piggott has deprived him of this honor. Clinton at this whole time is extremely depressed. He is not happy he's losing so many of his troops, so he's looking for an opportunity to do something. So he thought he'd have this whole big army of 25,000 men to command, and it's just not working out. So Newport is saved, but Clinton's not happy. So now what is he going to do? He's got 4,000 troops on board transport, all dressed up and no place to go. So he remembers his instructions from Germain. Attack seaports. Okay, I'll attack a seaport. I'll go to New London, where I drove through this afternoon. Greg goes down there with his 4,000 troops. The tide and the winds are not favorable. Clinton thinks he's got so much time there until Sullivan in Providence finds out and sends reinforcements down to New London. Well, what's in New London? It's Connecticut's principal privateers port. All right, on the left there you see a commission for a privateer, a private armed vessel. But they're safe in the harbor or upriver. The British can't get into the river. So Clinton fears that the Americans are going to swell with militia and Continentals, and he doesn't want to risk anything, so he sails away. Of course, Benedict Arnold will have much better luck, as the map there from 1781 shows. burn New London, and destroy Fort Griswold. But that's 3 years in the future. So Clinton sails away from New London. Now what am I going to do? Well, he's going to go back to New York with about 1,500 of the troops. And he's going to go to General Gray, one of his principal subordinate officers, and he's going to give Gray 2,500 men, including some of the flower of the British Army, the Grenadiers and the Light Infantry, the 33rd Regiment, some of the finest troops of the British Army. And he's going to say, you're going to start procuring provisions. This is what we're going to need to do for the next few weeks. Well, Gray sails off to Bedford, lands in Bedford, destroys a fort there, destroys 11 cannon there, they bring off some supplies. Okay, where do I go next? Martha's Vineyard. It's the middle of September now. It's off-season. Easier to get rooms, why not go to Martha's Vineyard? Okay? So, they sail to Martha's Vineyard. Of course, the vineyard is cut off from the mainland. While it is fairly populous, it's no match for a British army there. They come to some understandings and come off with a ton of capital and whatnot. In fact, Gray sends to Pickett at Rhode Island what Pickett referred to as a seasonable refreshment of 6,000 sheep. Right? 6,000 sheep and 130 oxen landing on the wharves of Newport in September 1778. What would be a really interesting lecture, that's a tangent here for a second, is after this period of the end of 78 to the evacuation of Newport, these tasks were left to loyalists, specifically a gentleman named George Leonard, who raised a corps for profit called the Loyal Associated Refugees. Love to come back here and spend an afternoon talking about them sometime. That's for another time. So Gray has gathered up as much cattle and whatnot as he can get, and send some here. He's going to take his men back now to New York City. What a lot of books don't talk about, you're going to have a campaign book, they don't talk about logistics, all right? For as many men that are serving in the lines, you need so many to provide the clothing, the weapons, the food, right? Civilians and soldiers both share that quality of needing food. So, the thing about the armies is they also come with horses, all right? Think about the cavalry, British cavalry, 2 British cavalry regiments in New York, totaling over 700 men. There's Loyalist cavalry, there's German cavalry. A lot of officers have their own horses. You need horses to pull wagons for all the civil branches, for the artillery. It's a lot easier to drag a cannon around with a horse than just a guy. Trust me on this one. Horses. Horses, what do horses eat? Hay, all right? Hay supplemented by oats, right? The oats primarily come from England, but the hay, they eat a lot of hay. Anybody know what the ration of hay is for a British horse per day? 14 pounds of hay. You multiply 14 pounds per day by several thousand horses. That's a lot of hay per day. And you have to think about how many weeks out you're going to need. And now you're provisioning all these ships to carry people to the West Indies, to Pensacola, to Nova Scotia. They're all going with horses too. So you pay for those periods. And you need food. You need fresh meat or salted meat, right? You need to bring in cattle for that. It's September. It's harvest season. So you need to bring in crops to supplement the soldiers' food. If you're sending them on board a ship, it's not like a Carnival cruise line, where you know the date of departure, you know what time, what day it's going to arrive somewhere. Well, 18th century ships are what? How are they propelled? Sailing ships, all right? You can estimate when they're going to arrive, but they're dependent upon wind, current, things of that nature, weather. So if your ship is blown way off course, and that happened, all right, several times ships going from north to south ended up in Ireland or England, Okay? That's off course. And you better make sure those ships are well provisioned. Because if you're lying in your bunk there, and a ship that's becalmed or off course, well, that guy in the bunk across from you at some point is going to start looking tasty. And the Royal Navy frowns down upon having their men look tasty to each other. So you want plenty of provisions on board these ships. You want plenty of provisions in garrison for your soldiers and the civilian populations. I mean, the British have a lot of civilians within their lines. Well, they need to eat too. So, General Gray returns with his force in Martha's Vineyard. They're well rested, they're refreshed, they send their postcards. So they're going to take those troops, add more to them, and 6,000 men under Lord Cornwallis are going to land at Paulus Hook. Paulus Hook is the British outpost on the west side of the Hudson River, directly opposite New York City. You know Paulus Hook much better today as Jersey City. Right? This is Bergen County at the time. Today it's Hudson County. There was no Hudson County in the 18th century. So these 6,000 troops are immediately in really nasty rainy weather going to march north up to the remains of Fort Lee, hang a left and head west to Liberty Pole, the first detachment of American troops they meet. 60 militia troops as an outpost are going to be introduced to 200 British cavalry. Right? 60 militia against 200 British cavalry, not a fair fight. The cavalry disperse the outpost and take 27 men prisoner and saber a bunch of others. The Grand Forage of 1778, as it has become known, has begun. Now, who is in Bergen County on the American side to counter 6,000 British and Loyalist troops? No Hessians, by the way, all British and Loyalists. Well, that lovely Georgian mansion on the left there was the home of Colonel Tunis Dye. Dye was the commander of the Bergen County Militia. Bergen County, during the time of the American Revolution, was primarily Loyalist. Not a great outpost of Whigs. Not a lot of congressional sympathy there. So Bergen County only had about 400 militiamen, and they had never yet in the war served as a regiment. Only in little detachments. 20 guys here, 30 guys here, 40 guys there, serving as guards and whatnot. Well, Dye was their commander. Gentleman on the right in the white coat faced blue, that's George Baylor. George Baylor was the commander of the 3rd Light Dragoons, one of 4 cavalry regiments of the Continental Army. Raised primarily in Virginia and Boston, they had been stationed in Bergen County since the time Washington's army moved through there after the Battle of Monmouth. They carried behind to garrison Hackensack. While there, they let their horses out into the farmer's fields. Now, horses are cool this way. They're sort of apolitical. They like the same food as the British horses do. It's hay, all right? They're good that way. So they're turned loose in the farmer's fields, and they're eating the hay. Well, that's great for the horses, but it's not so good for the farmers, because that's their crop. That's what they plan on selling to commissaries to make money. Just as Adam Smith planned it, a free exchange of money for goods and services. Well, Baylor's not paying for this hay. So the sheriff of the county is summoned. He's also a militia lieutenant. He gathers up a posse, and they go to Baylor's headquarters in Hackensack to serve a writ of habeas corpus on the quartermaster of Baylor's Dragoons to demand money for all this hay. Right before a nasty situation ensues, the survivors from Liberty Pole come streaming in, some of them with gashes from sabers. And they go, the British are here, there's 6,000 of them. As Baylor wrote to Washington later that night, the colonel and the sheriff and the posse looked at each other, departed, and he has yet to hear from them since. So, Baylor, bit of smug satisfaction, it would be short-lived. He takes his men, and realizing that 120 cavalry, which is what his unit consisted of, was not a match for 6,000 British and Loyalist troops. So they marched north to Paramus, several miles to the north to keep an eye on things. They prize Washington, who's in Westchester at this time. His army has moved from White Plains up to Fredericksburg. They had a chain. Basically, Washington's army was on a line from Danbury, Connecticut to West Point. So they're keeping an eye on the British from there. Baylor's informing them what's going on. Washington goes, okay, I'll send a brigade of infantry across the Hudson. We're going to station them in Clarkstown, Orange County, modern Rockland County, New York. Baylor, I want you to take your regiment and immediately march to Clarkstown and join the brigade of infantry that I'm sending over. Baylor says fine, and marches his cavalry troops, who are on horses, just a few miles to the modern town of Rivervale, in the 18th century known variously as Old Japan or Herringstown. And he's going to take his 6 troops of cavalry and put each one into a barn. The British instantly find out that where Baylor is. They also find out there's 400 Orange County militia in Tapan, which is only about 4 miles down the road from where Baylor's men are. So Cornwallis is personally going to lead 2,500 troops to attack these militia, and he's going to send our friend General Gray from Martha's Vineyard with 1,500 troops along the west side of the Hackensack River and attack Baylor's troops. 1,550 troops under General Gray, 120 sleeping troops under George Baylor. You can figure out what happened. That's General Gray on the right. On the left, that's several of Baylor's dragoons. How do we know those are Baylor's dragoons? Well, that's a photograph was taken in the mid-1960s in Rivervale in the remains of a tanning vat along the Hackensack River. All those little white dots that you see in there, those are buttons. What's on a number of the buttons? While I was writing this book, the county was so good as to give me access to those little white dots. Over 30 of them are marked LD, Light Dragoon. So there was not the least doubt that those are Baylor's dragoons. You can see one of the skulls there has been crushed in. Well, that indent matched perfectly with the butt of a British shortland pattern musket. So there was no doubt how that man met his fate. In fact, 16 of Baylor's men were instantly killed, 5 others mortally wounded. Baylor seriously wounded his second-in-command, Major Alexander Clow, mortally wounded, 47 officers and men taken prisoner, some of them wounded. Amongst the survivors, many of them fled, but also wounded. Due to the severe nature of the wounds and the casualties, the Americans sought to document exactly what happened. So they commissioned Governor William Livingston of New Jersey to gather up as much information from the survivors so they could use it mostly for propaganda purposes. They published all the accounts in the Philadelphia newspapers. Americans were very good that way. The accounts are in the book, but this will give you an idea of one survivor's ordeal that night, in his words. Samuel Brooking, being duly sworn, deposed and said that he is a private in Colonel Baylor's regiment of light horse in the service of the United States. That on the night of the 27th day of September last, this deponent, together with 19 others belonging to the said regiment, lodged in a barn in Herringstown near Tapan, and were alarmed with the number of the enemy which surrounded the said barn. The 3 of the men in the barn who attempted to get out were bayoneted in their attempt, upon which the others called out for quarter, upon which the British troops called out to them to come out of the barn, and our men, expecting upon that to have quarters, began to march out as prisoners, and the deponent among the rest. That as he came near the barn door, he received a stab with a bayonet in his arm, and in endeavoring to disengage his arm from the bayonet, he unlocked the bayonet from the firelock and made his escape through another door of the barn, the bayonet remaining in his arm, and he traveled with it sticking in his arm near 4 miles. As he was running from them, he had heard some of them who were still engaged in taking and killing our men cry out, "Skiver them! Give no quarter!" And the same cry he heard all along his passage from thence, Colonel Baylor's quarters, which he found also surrounded by the enemy. For those of you who've never seen an 18th century British bayonet, it's about yay long and triangular. He talks about unlocking it from the firelock. Firelock is another word for musket. The bayonet attaches to the end of the musket with a socket going over the sight or bayonet lug. You simply have to turn it a couple of ways and to unlock it. Much easier to do with your hand than with your arm, I imagine. So this was a gruesome incident and one of a number. For those who were taken prisoner, actually it was a good time to be taken prisoner, if there's ever such a thing. This was right at the time of a large general exchange between the two armies, and all the enlisted men who had been taken prisoner were exchanged within 6 weeks. The officers, however, were guests of the British for another 3 years. It didn't work out evenly with two sides, so the Americans got back all of their enlisted men. The British got back most of their officers, but not their enlisted men. It was a different sort of equation there. For the troops in Japan, the militia there, they were more fortunate. 2 men from Cornwallis's column deserted, went up to Japan, told them that 2,500 men were coming to kill them, and they fled. Notably, no one went down the road to tell Baylor that a similar force was coming for him. Not so much by way of retribution, it just seems that way. A force of Hessian Jaegers were defeated 2 days later by a force of American light infantry, including Henry Lee there. Our friend Joseph Plum Martin was a part of this action against 150 Hessian Jaegers. They managed to kill, wound, or capture about 30 of them. Martin's account of the battle is interesting, but more interesting to me is Martin's account of after the battle. Again, Martin's a teenager, he's not a professional soldier. And what's cool about Martin is everything is new to him. Right? Everything is a new experience, and he approaches it with that mindset. So this is his account of after this September 30th ambush of the Hessian Jaegers. It was an Irishman belonging to our infantry, who after the affray was over, seeing a wounded man belonging to the enemy lying in the road and unable to help himself, took pity on him, as he was in danger of being trodden upon by the horses, and having shouldered him was staggering off with his load in order to get him to a place of more safety. While crossing a small, worn-out bridge over a very muddy brook, he happened to jostle the poor fellow more than usual, who cried out, "Good rebel, don't hurt poor Hessian." "Who do you call a rebel, you scoundrel?" said the Irishman, and tossed him off his shoulders as unceremoniously as though he had been a log of wood. He fell with his head into the mud, and as I passed, I saw him struggling for life. But I had other business on my hands than to stop and assist him. I did sincerely pity the poor mortal, but pity him was all I could do. What became of him after I saw him in the mud, I never knew. Most likely he was there and made his final exit. Consequently, I never heard anything more of him, but the Irishman reminded me that the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. While the forage is going on in Bergen County, it's also going on in Westchester. Hessian Lieutenant General Kniphausen has taken a force of at least 3,000 British loyalist and Hessian troops into Westchester, and they're gathering forage the same as the British troops are doing in Bergen County. This is a close-up of an actual map made by John Andre, famous John Andre, of the British deployment in Bergen County. It's basically a line from Newbridge to Fort Lee. Fort Lee is on the Hudson River, Newbridge is on the Hackensack River. The only British to the west of Hackensack are on what was known as Brower Hill. They built 2 forts there and garrisoned them with the British 15th Regiment. The Americans who are left in New Jersey are at 2 places, Elizabethtown, right across from Staten Island, and modern Passaic, then known as Aquacannon. They are gathering a force of militia and Continentals at Aquacannon, and it's there that the American New Jersey militia general William Wins has decided he's going to be the hero here and attack the British at their forts at Brower Hill. He gathers up anywhere between 250 and 500 New Jersey militia. They cross over the Passaic River to modern Fair Lawn, 18th century Sluter Dam, march to Hackensack, then north to attack Brower Hill. They get to Brower Hill, and at a range of about 400 yards, open up with musketry. Okay? For you reenactors in the room, is that a very effective range for musketry? No. Well, the British shake their heads as well. They fire a few shots back. The Americans draw off and go back to Aquacannon. There are no casualties whatsoever, but it's like a nice reenactment. They clean their muskets at the end of the day, they have dinner, nobody's hurt, you know, they can tell their stories. It's cool. So, the British are left unmolested for the rest of their time in Bergen County. They're going to go up the 2 principal roads. The one on the left is, let me just show this here. This is the Strahlenberg Road, or the road to Japan. This is the Closter Road here. This is Liberty Pole here, the bridge there. And they're going to forage all up into this area here. Growing up, my house was about right here. Okay, so they foraged my neighborhood. So, my neighborhood had gotten over it by then. So, that's what they're going to do for the next couple of weeks. The Hackensack River is today got lots and lots of bridges on it. In the 18th century, New Bridge was the southernmost crossing point, and it was navigable for schooners, brigs, and sloops. And if you look at the river today, you can say that's not possible. It was. So the British took off 80 loads of forage from the Hackensack River alone. They would go south, sail out to Newark Bay, and then to either Staten Island or New York City to deposit their loads. The Americans in Newark finally decided at the beginning of October to try their luck attacking these ships that were sailing before them. And they burned 4 of them, only one of which actually had hay in it. From that point on, the British sent armed vessels with them, and that was that. One last foray of the forage. Clinton is again going to try his luck at attacking a port. Figured while he's gathering up all this forage, see if he can strike a blow against Egg Harbor, which the commander of an expedition there is going to term a nest of pirates. So 550 men, British and provincials, are going to go to Egg Harbor, and they're going to be under the command of the gentleman on the left there in red. That is the famous Captain Patrick Ferguson, shown here in the uniform of the Light Infantry Company of the British 70th Regiment of Foot. Ferguson is a dashing officer. He was wounded at Brandywine, leading a corps of riflemen. And these men were carrying a rifle that Ferguson himself invented, revolutionary in its nature, as it was a breech loader. Not only a breech loading rifle, but one that could fit a bayonet. Rifles of the 18th century were notable in that they did not generally adapt to bayonets. Ferguson took care of that. So, after being wounded at Brandywine, this was his first major command. He gets off to Egg Harbor, but this is where American intelligence has had a success. They know he's coming. All the privateers have sallied out. There's not a ship in the harbor. So Ferguson sails in. He sees a militia fort there with no cannon whatsoever. He lands his troops under fire from his ships. They fire a few shots each. The militia flee. Once again, it's a happy reenactment. There are no casualties, just dirty weapons at the end of the day. The British go about the town. They burn all the warehouses, all the ship stores, all the beautiful mansion houses of the ship's owners who've gotten rich off of captured British merchant ships. No problem. Well, you can't have the sacking of an American town and still hold your cushy position as congressman. So in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress has gotten their notices that the British are at Egg Harbor doing nasty things. So they're going to have to look around and send a force there. There are no troops in Philadelphia, though. And any troops in New Jersey, they believe, are engaged with the British in the north. Then they realize they do have a force. Anybody recognize the gentleman on the right? That's Casimir Pulaski. Pulaski is a Polish nobleman and adventurer, one of many Europeans who've come over to volunteer their services. Some for noble reasons, some for less than noble reasons. Pulaski is quite zealous, though. He is instantly given the command in the winter of 1778 of all the American cavalry. That does not sit well with all the American cavalry. It sits well with none of the American cavalry. So very soon thereafter, Pulaski resigns the command of the American cavalry. So he's no longer in command, but he's still a general. Well, you can't have generals sitting around doing nothing. I guess you can. There's plenty of precedent set. But here, Pulaski says, listen, don't have me sitting around doing nothing. I can raise a corps. Will be a corps primarily of Europeans. Take all these European officers that are coming over, offering their services, give them to me. There's plenty of Europeans in America who will enlist with me. I will raise a legion. You've heard me use the term legion before. Legion in the 18th century is a corps of both cavalry and infantry. And Pulaski is going to have his mounted troops as lancers, something completely unique in America. He's going to have light infantry, he's going to have grenadiers, he's going to have riflemen. They're going to wear incredible uniforms. It's the most expensive regiment in the Continental Army. Pulaski is in the neighborhood. He's in Princeton. Why is he in Princeton? Because Congress is auditing all his financial records. All right? If you wonder what a lot of research is today that survives, it's financial records in one degree or another. And thank God for it. So they're auditing Pulaski's books thinking, how did he spend this much money? But Washington wants him up to counter the British in Bergen County, but Congress is keeping him in Princeton. Well, all of a sudden Pulaski is their new best friend. They go help the good folks at Egg Harbor. Pulaski goes, fine. Chance for glory. He goes to Egg Harbor. Amongst his command is an officer known as Carl Joliet. Joliet is actually a Hessian deserter from here in Rhode Island. All right, one of the Hessian regiments that was on duty here. He's made his way to Philadelphia and offered his services to Congress. What else do you do if you're a deserter? You go to Congress. So he offers his services there. They say, oh, you're German, you're a deserter. We'll make you an officer in Pulaski's Legion. Here's a commission, go join Pulaski, who he's never met. He shows up, Pulaski goes, I don't know you, but okay, you go serve under my second in command, Lieutenant Colonel von Bose, a fellow German. Well, von Bose is quite a proud German officer and doesn't like having a German deserter as an officer under him. Those two don't get along. Joliet, apparently, as Pulaski later states, deserts back to the British and goes out and meets Patrick Ferguson on board the fleet. And in the course of research, there's one problem with that. Patrick Ferguson makes no mention of it. Pulaski makes great mention of it. Ferguson makes mention of another of Pulaski's officers, James de Bronville. In the background to that slide there, that's de Bronville's commission in Pulaski's Legion, which Pulaski sent back to Congress with the simple notation, de Bronville has left the Legion. Not that he deserted to them, just that he has left the Legion. Well, Patrick Ferguson says he came on board with 4 other deserters, and he, not Joliet, told Ferguson exactly where von Bose's picket guard for Pulaski's Legion was. 60 men by themselves, separated from the rest of the unit. Ferguson gathers up 300 of his men, lands at night, they fix bayonets, and wipe out Von Boza, literally wiped out Von Boza, he's dead, and 30 of his men. Pulaski pursues, but the British have taken up the planks of the bridge, make their way back safely. British sail back, sans one ship that gets stuck on a bar, and that ends Ferguson's expedition. And with that, that ends the Grand Forage. The British were moved from Bergen County on October 15th. They had moved back previously from Westchester. They had gathered up tons of supplies, and now Sir Henry Clinton is embarking all his troops. West Indies, Nova Scotia, Canada, Bermuda, Pensacola, and Georgia. 10,000 men. So many men are evacuating New York City, the Americans are actually convinced they're evacuating. There's Philadelphia newspapers proclaiming that New York City is being evacuated. Of course, that would not happen for 5 more years. Now, 2 of these are expeditions. December 1778, Grant arrives off St. Lucia, captures the island. His fleet meets once again Count d'Estaing, whose ships have been refitted at Boston. They sail down too late to prevent the loss of St. Lucia. This is actually the naval battle off the island. The British on the landward side. The battle is more or less inconclusive, but the French can't get in, they can't score victory. They sail away. The British for now have St. Lucia. The other expedition to Georgia, 2,500 men under Lieutenant Colonel Campbell with the British 71st Regiment, defeat 500 Continental troops under General Elbert outside of Savannah. Elbert's entire command is killed, wounded, or captured for the loss of 12 or 14 British. Campbell is so pleased with himself, he writes a glowing report of the victory and carries it himself to England. Well, he went on board a ship, it's easier. But he sailed with the report to England to make the report, proudly stating he was the first British officer to tear a star and a stripe from the American flag. So, Lord Cornwallis, what conclusions can we learn from this expedition? Was the war won for the British? No. There's plenty of American flags around town, we know who won. So the war was not won for the British. Was Washington's army routed by Clinton? No. Washington's army was never really engaged other than detachments, so that didn't happen. Were the privateers destroyed? No. The British never got at them at New London or Egg Harbor, so that didn't happen. Was the forage obtained? Yes. They came off with about 60 tons from Westchester and between 400 and 500 tons from Bergen County. Very happy horses at the end of the day. Were the expeditions successful? Yes. Right? They captured St. Lucia and they captured Georgia. Good going there. Were the garrisons maintained? Yes, at least for now. The French never attacked Nova Scotia, so Halifax was never in danger. The Spanish eventually captured West Florida, but that wasn't until 1781. Is there more material for me to write new books? Yes, clearly there is. And with that, thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions. Here's some questions. I could not have possibly told you everything.
Ann Bates, so she was captured going back.
Right. And she got away.
She somehow got away.
Yep.
And then she went back for some more espionage.
Yeah, she actually marched with one.